The hum was the first sign of trouble. Not the familiar, steady drone of the server banks in the adjacent room, a sound that had become the white noise of her late nights at the office, but a disruption in its rhythm. A subtle dip, a flicker, as if the building had held its breath for a second too long. Nia's fingers stilled on the keyboard, her head tilting. The silence that followed was heavy, artificial. The usual nocturnal orchestra of Tokyo, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a train on an elevated track, was gone, muffled by something she couldn't identify. She reached for her cane, the smooth, worn wood a familiar anchor in her world of texture and sound. The polished grip felt cool against her palm. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She was alone. Mr. Abe had left hours ago, his shuffling footsteps and muttered goodbyes echoing down the hall. This was different. This was a presence. She pushed her chair back, the wheels catching for a moment on the worn carpet. Standing, she listened, mapping the space with her ears. The scent of stale coffee and printer toner was suddenly pierced by something else. Ozone, sharp and clean, and under it, the faint, metallic tang of blood. Her breath hitched. She took a step, her cane sweeping in a gentle arc before her, tapping softly against the leg of a desk. Then voices. Low, guttural, and dangerously close. They were in Mr. Abe's office, the one that shared a wall with her own small secretarial space. It's done, one voice said. The words clipped. The files are wiped. The hardware is useless. And him. A second voice, smoother, colder. He was not cooperative. A wet, heavy sound followed, like a soaked towel being dropped onto a hard floor. Nia clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. Her mind raced, piecing it together. Mr. Abe had been involved in something far beyond the small-time import-export business he claimed to run. And these men were here to clean up a loose end. She began to back away, her movements slow, deliberate. Her cane found the edge of her own desk, and she used it to guide herself toward the door, her stockinged feet making no sound on the thin carpet. She had to get out. The fire escape was at the end of the hall. If she could just reach it. Check the rest of the floor, the second voice commanded.
No witnesses.
Panic seized her, cold and sharp. Her hand fumbled for the doorknob. She could hear them moving now, the soft scuff of expensive leather shoes on linoleum. They were coming. She was a witness. A blind witness, yes, but she had heard their voices, smelled the cloying sweetness of one man's cologne, the sharp scent of cedar on the other. She knew, and they knew she knew. The doorknob to her office began to turn. The door swung inward with a soft click, flooding her small office with the scent of rain and cold steel. The two men paused in the doorway, their surprise a tangible thing in the air. Nia stood frozen, her hand still on the doorknob, her cane held tight in the other. She could feel their eyes on her, could sense the shift in their posture from methodical cleanup crew to predators who had stumbled upon unexpected prey. Well, what do we have here? The first voice said, the one with the rough edges. He sounded almost amused. She's blind, the second, smoother voice stated. It was not a question. He must have seen her cane, the way her eyes were unfocused, staring at a point on the wall just past his shoulder. Nia's throat was tight. I didn't hear anything, she said, her own voice a strained whisper. I was just working late. I'm just the secretary. A secretary who works past midnight, the first man scoffed. Convenient. She felt him move closer, the air displacing around him. His cologne was stronger now, a cheap, musky scent that made her stomach turn. What do we do with her, Rio? The one named Rio was silent for a long moment. Nia could hear the quiet hum of his breathing, the faint rustle of his suit jacket. He was assessing her, calculating. She heard us. She's a liability. The air grew thick with unspoken violence. Nia's every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. They were between her and the door, two solid masses of muscle and menace. She could map their positions perfectly, the heat radiating from their bodies, the distinct sounds of their presence. The first man was fidgeting, the jingle of keys in his pocket a nervous tick. Rio was perfectly still. He was the one in charge. He was the danger. Just as the silence stretched to its breaking point, a new sound joined the tense tableau. Footsteps, measured and precise, coming down the hall. These were different. Each step was placed with an absolute, unhurried authority. The two men in her office straightened, their bodies going rigid with deference. The air temperature seemed to drop several degrees. A man appeared in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the dim light from the hall.
He didn't speak.
He didn't have to. His presence was a physical force, a weight that settled over the room and pressed the air from Nia's lungs. The scent that came with him was subtle but unmistakable, clean, sharp cedar and the cold fragrance of a winter night. He moved like the room owed him space. "Report," he said. The word was not loud, but it cut through the tension like a shard of glass. "The target is neutralized. The data is secured," Rio said, his voice stripped of its earlier smoothness, now deferential. "We found a witness. A secretary. She was working late," he paused. "She's blind." The new man was silent. Nia felt his attention settle on her, a gaze so intense it was like a physical touch. It was unnerving, to be seen so clearly by someone she could not see at all. She could hear the whisper-soft sound of his tailored suit as he took a single step into the room. He was contemplating her existence, weighing her life on a scale she couldn't begin to comprehend. Her fate was being decided in that terrible, drawn-out silence. Finally, he gave his judgment, his voice devoid of any emotion at all.
"No witnesses."
The two words were a death sentence, delivered with the same casual finality as a man ordering a coffee. The rough-voiced man took a step toward her, his intention a palpable wave of aggression. Nia's life didn't flash before her eyes. Instead, a single, strange image bloomed in the darkness of her mind, a woman with a gentle smile, standing under a cascade of cherry blossoms, a single white gardenia tucked behind her ear. And with the image came a name, a whisper from a place she did not recognize. It was a desperate, nonsensical gamble, a shot fired into the void. As the man's hand reached for her shoulder, the name spilled from her lips, soft but clear in the suffocatingly quiet room. Yuna. Everything stopped. The man reaching for her froze mid-motion. Rio let out a sharp, incredulous breath. But it was the boss, the man whose presence commanded the very air, whose reaction was the most profound. He went utterly, unnaturally still. The quiet rhythm of his breathing ceased. For a terrifying second, Nia thought he might have stopped breathing altogether. The scent of cedar and rain was suddenly overwhelming. When he finally moved, it was with a speed that was startling. He was in front of her in an instant, his body close enough that she could feel the heat of him, the coiled power held in perfect check. He reached out, not to harm her, but to cup her chin, his fingers surprisingly gentle but firm, tilting her face up toward his. His touch was like a brand, a shock of warmth against her cold skin. "What did you say?" His voice was a low growl, a dangerous vibration that resonated deep in her chest. All traces of dispassionate authority were gone, replaced by something raw and intensely personal. "Yuna," she repeated, her voice trembling but resolute.
She did not know why. She did not know how.
The name was simply there, a key she had unknowingly held. He released her chin, but he didn't move away. He stood over her, a mountain of contained fury and disbelief. He was too close, his presence an invasion of her space, of her senses. She could hear the frantic beat of her own heart, and beneath it, the impossibly steady, controlled rhythm of his. "How?" he said, the word not a question but a demand, each syllable laden with a threat that promised consequences she could not imagine. "How do you know that name?" He would not kill her now. She knew that with a sudden, chilling certainty. Death would have been a simpler fate. He couldn't let her go, not until he had an answer. She had ceased to be a loose end to be tied up. She was now a ghost, a puzzle, a wound he had to tear open. Ryo's voice cut through the charged silence, hesitant. Boss. Kaido Tanaka did not turn. His focus was entirely, terrifyingly on Nia. Take her, he commanded, his voice once again cold and absolute. She comes with us. Nia was escorted from the building, a hand firmly on her elbow. The world she had known, the predictable rhythm of her small life, the safety of her anonymity, had been erased in the space of a single heartbeat. She was being led into darkness by men who dealt in death, all because of a name she should not have known. The cool night air hit her face, carrying the scent of the city and the deeper, more dangerous scent of the man who now held her life in his hands. The door of a luxury car opened, and she was gently but firmly pushed inside. The engine purred to life, a low growl that sounded like a promise and a threat all at once. The car pulled away from the curb, stealing her away from one life and delivering her into the heart of another, a world of shadows and secrets ruled by a man haunted by a ghost she had just named. The penthouse was an exercise in sensory warfare. The moment she stepped out of the private elevator, Nia was assaulted. The air was cool and carried the heavy, sweet perfume of fresh orchids and the clean, grounding scent of sandalwood. The floor beneath her feet changed from the soft plush of a runner to the cold, unforgiving smoothness of polished marble, the clicks of her cane echoing in a space so vast it felt like a cathedral. She was guided to a sofa, the fabric beneath her hand impossibly soft, sinking under her weight. It felt like silk. She heard the soft clink of glass on stone as someone set a drink on a table nearby. The silence here was different from the office. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence, the weight of money, power, and isolation. Kaido didn't speak for a long time. He let her sit there, marinating in the unfamiliar environment, letting the luxury and the strangeness of it all work on her. He was pacing. She could track his movements by the whisper of his trousers and the near-silent fall of his expensive shoes on the marble. He was circling her, a shark in his own opulent tank. Finally, he stopped directly in front of her. "Let's try this again," he said, his voice a low, controlled instrument of intimidation. "You will tell me how you know the name Yuna. You will not lie to me. If I even suspect you are lying, Rio will take you to a place with no orchids and no silk, and he will ask you again. He is not as patient as I am." Nia swallowed, her throat dry. "I'm not lying. I don't know how I know the name." She lifted her chin in the direction of his voice. "I wish I did. It came to me, like a memory that isn't mine. A picture in my head." "A picture," he scoffed, the sound sharp with disbelief. "You're blind." "I haven't always been," she said quietly. "I lost my sight 5 years ago. I remember what things look like. I remember colors. I saw a woman, under a tree with pink flowers. She was wearing a white dress. It was the truth, as bizarre as it sounded. The image had been so vivid, so real." He was silent for so long that she began to think he'd left the room. But she could still feel his presence, the sheer force of his attention fixed on her. "Describe her," he commanded, his voice tight. "Dark hair, long. A kind face." She was smiling, but it was sad. Like she knew something was about to end. Nia's voice faltered. "And she had a flower. A white one. In her hair." Another heavy silence. She heard him move, the sound of a heavy crystal decanter being lifted, the splash of liquid into a glass. The sharp scent of whiskey cut through the air. "That is not possible," he said, more to himself than to her. He sounded shaken, the first crack in his icy composure. He didn't believe in ghosts or psychics. He believed in facts, in leverage, in violence. She was an anomaly he could not categorize, and it was making him unstable. He saw her confidence, the way she held herself without cowering, and it intrigued him as much as it frustrated him. She was not like the other women in his world, who were either trophies or victims. She was something else entirely. Days bled into one another. Nia was a prisoner in a gilded cage. She was given a room, luxurious and sterile, but the door was always guarded. She spent her time exploring her immediate surroundings with her cane and her fingertips, mapping the textures of the walls, the furniture, the heavy silk curtains. One afternoon, drawn by a faint, almost imperceptible floral scent that was different from the orchids in the main room, she found a door that was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, her cane swept into a room that felt different. The air was still and held the ghost of a perfume, gardenia. The room was a shrine. She didn't need to see it to know. The reverence was a tangible thing. Her fingers brushed against a wooden frame on a dresser, tracing the outline of a photograph. She ran her hand over a silk kimono laid out on the bed, the fabric impossibly smooth. On a small table, a single, perfect white gardenia sat in a small vase of water. It scent the one that had drawn her here. It was fresh. He was keeping her memory alive, tending to it like a garden. "What are you doing in here?" Kaido's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet sanctity of the room. He was standing in the doorway, his silhouette a dark slash against the light from the hall. He wasn't angry. He was wounded. She had trespassed on his most private grief. "I smelled the flower," she said softly, not moving from her spot by the bed. "It's Yuna's room, isn't it?" He walked in, his footsteps slow. He didn't answer. He walked over to the small table and his fingers brushed against the petals of the gardenia. "She was killed," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. "By a rival clan. The Hashimoto. They used her to send me a message. It was my fault. I brought her into this life. I promised her I could protect her." He paused, the weight of his failure filling the space between them. "I was wrong." This was his shame, the core of his coldness. It wasn't just grief, it was a profound, personal failing that had defined him ever since. Nia felt a pang of empathy for this ruthless, dangerous man. She understood the language of loss. She shivered, though the room was not cold. He noticed. Without a word, he turned, took a soft cashmere throw from the end of the bed, her kimono, she realized, and draped it over her shoulders. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, it was like a spark in the dark. It was small, almost undeniable, but it was there. A flicker of the man he might have been before the world had carved the humanity out of him. He hadn't touched her since that first night, and this contact, impersonal as it was, felt monumental. The fragile peace of that moment was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. A sharp crack, followed by a whistling sound that passed so close to Nia's head, she felt the air move. The heavy marble lamp on the bedside table exploded, showering the floor with debris. A sniper. From the building opposite. The Hashimoto clan, sending another message. Before Nia could even process what had happened, Kaido moved. He was a blur of motion, reacting with the instinct of a man born to violence. He threw himself at her, his body a solid wall of muscle, tackling her to the floor and shielding her with his own weight. They landed hard. The air knocked from her lungs. Shards of marble and plaster rained down around them. "Stay down," he snarled in her ear, his voice a low, urgent command. His breath was hot against her skin, his body pressing her into the thick rug. More shots followed, punching holes through the wall, where they had just been standing. In the chaos, with the roar of gunfire filling the air and the weight of him holding her down, a strange clarity pierced through Nia's fear. This was his world. This was the price of his proximity. She could have stayed there, passive, protected beneath him, but that was not who she was. As his men, alerted by the shots, stormed the penthouse, their shouts and returning fire adding to the cacophony, Nia acted. Her hand, free from his grip, scrambled across the floor, her fingers closing around the heaviest piece of the shattered lamp base. It was a jagged piece of marble, hefty and solid. She didn't know if she would need it or who she would use it on, but she would not be helpless. In the heart of the firefight, pinned beneath the most dangerous man in Tokyo, Nia made a choice. She gripped the makeshift weapon, her knuckles white. She was no longer just a witness or a prisoner.
She was in this now.
The silence that descended after the firefight was more deafening than the noise. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and dust. Kaido shifted off her, his movements economical and precise. He was on his feet in an instant, issuing a string of cold, rapid-fire orders to Rio, who stood in the doorway, his own weapon still drawn. Nia pushed herself into a sitting position, her ears ringing. The marble fragment was still clutched in her hand, its sharp edges digging into her palm. Kaido noticed it. He glanced down at her, at the makeshift weapon, and then back at her face. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of grudging respect in his dark eyes. He didn't comment on it, but he had seen it. He had seen that she was not a passive victim. He turned back to his lieutenant. Double the perimeter. I want eyes on every rooftop from here to the river. Find the nest. Bring me the man who was in it. Alive, his voice was pure ice. The order was a promise of a slow, painful death. Nia flinched. Hearing him give the command was different from imagining it. This was the reality of the man who had draped a blanket over her shoulders just moments before. He was a protector and a monster, woven together so tightly she couldn't find the seam. It was a truth that should have sent her scrambling for the nearest exit, but the door to her old life was gone, shattered like the lamp on the floor. Later that night, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a thrumming, nervous tension. Kaido had her moved to a different room, one in the core of the penthouse with no windows. It was for her safety, he'd said, but it felt more like a cage than ever. She could hear him in the main living area, his voice a low, dangerous murmur as he spoke on the phone. She couldn't make out the words, only the lethal calm of his tone. He was waging a war, and she was the territory being fought over. She discovered the true, unforgiving nature of his power by accident. A new guard, younger and less disciplined than the others, was posted outside her door. He was speaking quietly on his phone, thinking she couldn't hear. Yes, the boss was clear, the guard whispered. The whole family, not just the shooter. His brother runs a bakery in Ginza. His sister is a professor at the university. Hashimoto wanted to send a message by targeting the woman. The boss is sending a message back. An entire bloodline erased. No exceptions. Nia felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't just about retaliation against soldiers. This was about eradicating people who had nothing to do with this war. A baker, a professor, innocent adults, targeted simply for sharing blood with an enemy. It was a line she hadn't known existed, and he had crossed it without a second thought. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the silk comforter cool against her skin. The man who had shielded her with his body, who tended a dead woman's memory with fresh flowers, was capable of a barbarity that stole her breath. This was the man she was tied to. The knowledge was a cold stone in her stomach. Running was no longer just a matter of escape, it was a matter of moral survival. But how could she run from a man who had the entire city in his grip? The Hashimoto clan was bleeding, but they were not broken. And Kaido had underestimated their desperation. They made their move when the penthouse was at its most secure, which was, paradoxically, its most vulnerable. They didn't come through the windows or the doors. They came through the staff. A cleaner, a woman who had worked in the building for a decade, had a debt that the Hashimoto clan was all too happy to pay in exchange for a service key and 5 minutes of distraction. Nia was being escorted to the main living area by one of Kaido's men when it happened. The guard's phone buzzed, a summons from Rio. He hesitated, looking at her, then at the elevator. Stay here. Don't move, he ordered, before jogging down the hall. It was a fatal mistake. The moment he was out of sight, a hand clamped over Nia's mouth, another arm snaking around her waist, lifting her off her feet. She didn't scream. She fought. She stomped her heel down hard on her attacker's instep and drove her elbow back into his ribs. He grunted in pain, but didn't release her. He was strong, dragging her toward a service elevator she hadn't known existed. When Kaido discovered she was gone, the legendary coldness that defined him burned away, leaving behind a white-hot, silent fury. The world didn't just tilt. It fractured. The thought of failing again, of losing another woman he had taken under his protection, was not something he could endure. His grief for Yuna had been a cold, passive thing, a shrine he tended. This was different. This was an act of fire. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He became terrifyingly calm. He walked over to a display case, unlocked it, and removed a single, wickedly curved blade. Rio, he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of death. Find out where they took her.
Now.
Nia, meanwhile, was not a passive captive. Thrown into the back of a van, she focused, pushing past the terror. She used her senses. The van smelled of fish and saltwater. They were near the docks. She listened to the turns, the traffic patterns, building a map in her head. Her captors were careless. They spoke openly. They were taking her to an old fish processing plant in the Toyosa district. And they made the mistake of leaving her cane with her, tossing it in beside her like an afterthought. It was an extension of her body, and now it was a tool. When they dragged her out of the van and into the cavernous, freezing plant, she deliberately let the tip of her cane snag on a loose grate, leaving a small, almost invisible scratch in the rust. A few feet later, she scraped it against a metal pillar. She was leaving a trail only someone looking for one would find. Inside, they tied her to a chair. The air was thick with the stench of bleach and old decay. The head of the Hashimoto clan entered the room. He was an older man, his voice raspy. "So, you are the new ghost," he said, circling her. "Let's see if Tanaka is willing to trade a piece of his empire for you." Nia lifted her head. "He won't trade," she said, her voice steady. "He will come. And he will kill every last one of you." It wasn't a threat. It was a prophecy. Then she did something they never expected. She looked one of her captors, a young, nervous man to her left, directly in the eyes, or where she perceived them to be. "You should let me go," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The west entrance is clear. I heard them say it. Get out while you can." It was a lie, a piece of misdirection born of pure survival instinct. The west entrance was a bottleneck, a death trap she had intuited from the building's acoustics. She was sending him to his death to create a diversion. In that moment, she crossed a line she could never uncross, using the enemy's tactics against them. The young man hesitated, his fear warring with his duty. That hesitation was all Kaido would need. The attack, when it came, was not a frontal assault. It was a surgical strike. Kaido's men materialized from the shadows of the fish plant like specters, moving with a silence that was more terrifying than any battle cry. The diversion Nia had created worked perfectly. The young guard, spooked by her certainty, made a break for the west entrance, drawing the attention of two others. It created a fatal gap in their defense. Kaido himself came through the main floor, a wraith in a black suit, the curved blade in his hand a sliver of moonlight in the gloom. He moved through the chaos not like a man, but like a force of nature. Hashimoto, seeing his men fall, grabbed Nia, pulling her from the chair and holding a knife to her throat. "One more step, Tanaka, and she dies just like your wife," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. Kaido stopped. He stood 20 feet away, perfectly still, the carnage he had just wrought forgotten. His eyes were locked on Nia, on the blade at her neck. The air crackled with tension. This was the moment, the replay of his greatest failure. But Nia was not Yuna. She would not be a passive victim in his tragedy. "He's lying, Kaido," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through Hashimoto's panicked threats. Yuna wasn't killed by him. She felt Hashimoto's grip tighten, his surprise a tremor against her back. She wouldn't have let him get close enough. She knew who the real traitor was. It was a bluff, a wild guess spun from the sadness she'd seen in the phantom memory, from the whispers of her own intuition. But it landed with the force of a physical blow. Hashimoto faltered. Kaido's eyes narrowed, a dawning, terrible understanding on his face. In that split second of hesitation, Nia acted. She stomped down on Hashimoto's foot with all her might and threw her head back, smashing it into his nose. He roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Kaido closed the distance in 2 silent strides. There was a blur of motion, a single, final sigh from Hashimoto, and then he collapsed, a crimson flower blooming on the front of his shirt. Nia stumbled forward into the sudden, ringing silence, her legs shaking. Kaido caught her, his hands steady on her arms. He didn't pull her into a cinematic embrace. He just held her, keeping her upright, his grip firm. The room smelled of blood and the sea. The last of Hashimoto's men were being dealt with in the background, but in that small circle of space, there was only the two of them. He gently tilted her chin up, his thumb brushing against her cheek. His eyes searched her face, not for injury, but for something else. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice low and raw. "I didn't," she whispered. "I just knew he wasn't the one she was afraid of." He looked at her for a long time, the cold mask of the crime boss stripped away, leaving only the man, raw and exposed. "For 5 years," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name, "this city has been a graveyard. My house, a tomb." He took a breath, a ragged, unsteady thing. "You are the first thing that has felt alive in it." It was not a declaration of love. It was something heavier, more dangerous. A confession. An admission that she had become his anchor in a world where he had long been adrift. He was acknowledging what she was to him, and it was a claim more powerful than any chain. The aftermath was quiet. A cost had been paid. Rio had lost 2 men, loyal soldiers whose absence was a tangible void. In Kaido's world, nothing was free, and survival always came with a bill. The mystery of the true traitor in Yuna's death was now a fresh wound, one Kaido would pursue with relentless, cold fury. But that was his war. Nia's was over. The next morning, Kaido came to her. He had a suitcase in his hand. Her suitcase, from her old apartment, which his men had discreetly cleared out. He set it on the floor beside her. "You are free to go, Nia," he said, his voice formal, distant. The wall was back up, the ice reforming. "I have arranged for a flight to anywhere you want. A new name, a new life. No one will ever find you. You will be safe." He was giving her back her freedom, the one thing he had taken from her. He was giving her a choice. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't imply she should. He simply laid the option before her, a clean, sharp break. Nia stood in the center of the vast living room, the morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows she could feel but not see. She could smell the orchids, the sandalwood, the faint, lingering scent of his cedar cologne. She thought of her old life, the quiet predictability of her desk, the anonymous hum of the city. It was safe. It was simple. And it was empty. That life was a black and white photograph. This world, his world, was terrifying and violent, but it was searingly, undeniably alive. It was full color. She could walk out that door and never look back. She could erase the last few weeks, erase him. She could pretend she had never heard the name Yuna, never felt the weight of his body shielding hers, never heard the raw confession in his voice. She didn't. Instead of walking toward the door, she turned and walked deeper into the penthouse. Her cane tapped a soft, steady rhythm against the marble floor, a sound of decision, of finality. She found him on the balcony, looking out over the sprawling expanse of Tokyo. He didn't turn as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her every step. She stopped beside him, the breeze cool on her face, carrying the sounds of the city far below. They stood in silence for a long time, not touching, just sharing the same space, the same air. The silence was not empty. It was filled with everything that had happened between them, and everything that was about to. Finally, he moved. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her. He simply extended his arm, the crook of his elbow offered to her in a silent, formal gesture. It was not a command. It was an invitation, a question. Nia hesitated for only a heartbeat. Then she reached out, her fingers finding the expensive fabric of his suit jacket, and slid her hand into the space he offered. She took his arm. His muscles tensed for a moment under her touch, and then relaxed, accepting her presence, her choice. Together, they stood and faced the city, 2 solitary figures bound by a ghost and a future that was as dangerous and uncertain as it was inevitable.